I'd like to begin by acknowledging the country that I live on. I live high on the ridgeline that was the boundary between the Darug Nation to the north and the Gundagara peoples to the south. So I acknowledge both the Darug and the Gundagara and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I want to thank ANZSOC for the recognition and for the award. Intellectual work, I think, is always a collective endeavour, and I'd really like to acknowledge my colleagues, particularly those that I've worked with and done research with and co-authored with over the last decade or so. I also want to acknowledge my fantastic colleagues at Jumbunna Institute for Indigenous Education and Research. I've really never had the privilege of working with such a great team of people before, and a group of people who are constantly inspiring in terms of their activism, their advocacy, their political engagement, and their scholarship and creative work. I was genuinely surprised when I was offered the award. 2 days before I received the email from ANZSOC, I'd been on social media bemoaning once again the quietism of criminologists and criminal lawyers, this time compared to public health advocates. It was at the time in either late October or early November when the American Public Health Association had just passed its national policy supporting abolitionism as an important public health concern. And that policy was passed by 86% of their members at their annual general meeting. And this came on top of again, an American Public Health Association policy which they had passed in 2018, supporting Black Lives Matter and supporting calls to defund the police, and recognising that divestment from police and investment in community was an important public health outcome. So when the award was offered, I was reminded of a comment by Stan Cohen in his essay Against Criminology that he wrote back in 1988. And I'll just read very quickly the comment that he made in that essay. My relationship with criminology is, I suppose, some variety of what used to be called repressive tolerance. Every attempt I've ever made to distance myself from the subject, to criticise it, even to question its very right to exist, has only got me more involved in its inner life. This is, of course, not just a personal experience, but the shared fate of most of us who some 20 years ago embarked on a collective project of constructing an alternative to criminology. The more successful our attack on the old regime, the more we received publishers' contracts, research funds, appeared on book lists, and received awards from professional associations. And for decades after he wrote this, Stan Cohen continued to engage with critical criminological debates, importantly and particularly including crimes of the state and genocide. I also raise this because I think it points to a really rich history and continuity of radical thought that surrounds this sort of intellectual object and practices that we call criminology. It's been there from the 1960s through to the present day, and much of which has in the past and continues today to question whether criminology has a right to exist. Part of the problem is that criminology has never been a single set of ideas and practices. As Cohen acknowledged in his Against Criminology essay, it ranged politically across different modes of thinking, from conservative, managerialist and technocratic to socialist, abolitionist, and I would add to that decolonial. So the idea of a singular criminology is something of a chimera. It only exists in our imagination. And there have been multiple and diverse influences on radical thought in criminology, and I'm not going to attempt to name them. However, what interests me in particular is the joining of political activism with critical criminological thought, as we saw, for example, in Britain in the late 1970s and 1980s between Marxism and the great Black British intellectuals like Stuart Hall, Paul Gilroy and Stephen Andren, and their burning critiques of policing, police violence and racism. And we've seen it similarly in the US as a continuity in political action and intellectual insights around racism and abolitionism, from the Black Panthers to critical resistance to the contemporary Black Lives Matter movement, and the great intellectual activists like Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Mariam Kaba, and others that have actually spanned these decades, some of whom have and do work within criminology and criminal justice departments, like in the US, for example, Beth Ritchie, and the critical disability and abolitionist activist, Liat Ben-Moshe. We can see the importance of community activism in the Australian context, from the Prisoners Action Group in the 1970s to Sisters Inside today, from the Black Power movement in the late 60s and early 70s that led to the establishment of the Aboriginal Legal Service, to the First Nations-led Committee to Defend Black Rights in the 1980s that resulted in the establishment of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and to the families and their supporters today of those that have died at the hands of police and prison authorities. And in this context, I want to particularly acknowledge Latoya Rule and other family members of Wayne Fella Morrison, who died in South Australian correctional custody, and the success of that family in the banning the use of spit hoods in that state. I think it's an important victory for community activism. So I'd like to just finish up on 2 points. One is the contemporary nature of state violence. It seems to me the police murder of Aboriginal woman JC in Geraldton highlighted everything that's so drastically wrong with the criminal legal system. An Aboriginal woman who has been criminalised and imprisoned for mental illness, who's released without the necessary support in the community. And when a family call for help, it's dealt with as a police matter. And the full violence of the state ensues. 8 police respond to a mental health crisis, and she's gunned down with impunity by a police officer who has his identity suppressed. At the same time, in 2020, we've seen a record number of fatal police shootings. That to me is what the stuff of a critical and politically engaged criminology should be about. And so the last point, the final point, is on solidarity. And I want to acknowledge the importance of building solidarity across groups. And I want to leave the sort of final words to Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Simpson, who are 2 of the finest North American First Nation scholars. And to quote from Glenn Coulthard and Leanne Simpson, they write, "When we disappear Indigenous presence from our intellectual endeavours, our movement building and our scholarship, we not only align ourselves with the wrong side of history, we necessarily negate any form of solidarity, and we become actors in the maintenance of settler colonialism." Thank you.